Weeks into Ukraine's highly anticipated counteroffensive, Western officials have been giving rather sobering assessments about Ukrainian forces' ability to retake significant territory. Ukrainian forces have faced continued difficulty of breaking through Russia's multi-layered defensive lines in the eastern and southern parts of the country. Now, is this a touch phase for Ukraine, or should one deem the counteroffensive a failure already? Is Russia's multi-layered defensive line impossible to break? To discuss this further, we are being joined by Dr. Gilbert Doctorow on International Affairs, an International Affairs Analyst, author and historian. Always a pleasure to be speaking with you, sir.
Good to be invited.
Right. Dr. Gilbert, now we'll start right off with this. Why has the counteroffensive not achieved the desired results?
Let me say at the outset that what I'm about to explain is not based on my expertise as a military man. I'm not. But I am a close follower of both mainstream Western information, dealing analysis on the progress of the counteroffensive, and more particularly on the Russian side of the story, which your readers, listeners are unlikely to have access to.
Absolutely.
By that I mean state television news and talk shows. What they are putting out is that the Ukrainians were not provided with enough or appropriate equipment by the United States and NATO allies to have a successful counteroffensive. And in particular, of course, there was no air cover, but the United States and allies underestimated the strength of Russia's engineering work in defense systems that you just mentioned. And the equipment, such as the Leopards, tanks from Germany, were utterly inadequate to the task of overcoming these minefields and other obstructions.
Dr. Gilbert, now there's a fear of the blame game in the Western alliance. Some officials fear that the widening gap between expectations and results among the Ukrainian officials and their Western supporters may create divisions within the alliance. So what do you feel about this? Do you feel that this failure, or rather the slow counteroffensive progress rate, could bring about a rift in the Western alliance?
I think we're looking in the wrong place. It's not the alliance that is going to be split and will cause suspension of assistance to Ukraine. The alliance, after all, is totally dependent on the United States for overall guidance and for the supply of the vast majority of military equipment that's heading to Ukraine. So what we have to look at is a split within the United States. And there, indeed, the failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive has opened the field to critics of the Biden administration in Congress and in the broad public. And particularly, this is of risk to Biden because of the upcoming start of the electoral season for the presidential elections of 2024. In that perspective, both within the Democratic Party, in the person of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and in the Republican Party, in the persons of the leading candidates Trump and DeSantis, we can expect, as the weeks and months come on, there will be sharp attack for Biden in a blame game, as you say, over why the United States and its allies have, quote, lost Ukraine.
Now, Dr. Gilbert, now, of course, you touched upon it a little briefly earlier. I would request if you could, elaborate a little further on Russia's multi-layered defensive lines. I understand you're not a military expert, but there is a lot which has been spoken about this defensive line that Russia set up. There was a lot which was spoken about several thousands of drones, mines, which Russia had set up on its defensive lines, which also caused a major reason, which was one of the major reasons why Ukraine wasn't able to achieve the results that it did. Is it impossible to break past Russia's multi-layered defensive line?
Well, nothing is impossible, but the human cost is totally unacceptable, and Ukraine is incapable of supporting it. As it turns out, in the first 2 months of this counteroffensive, they lost 46,000 of their elite troops, which is a large majority of the 60,000 or so elite troops that were trained by the United States and its allies in the lead-up to this counteroffensive. So the human cost is impossible. But it's not just the mines here. It's also the ability of the Russians to very quickly restore mines. After a mine-cleaning effort by Ukrainian forces at great cost in equipment and manpower, the Russians very swiftly restore the minefield. And this was not anticipated. There's another factor here. The United States guided the Ukraine in a method of fighting that is totally dependent on superior communications channels, so that all elements of the attack are coordinated in real time by this superior communications. The Russians have surprised everyone by their electronic warfare capabilities that have knocked out these GPS and other systems on which the United States way of fighting is dependent. That was unanticipated, and it has greatly handicapped the Ukrainian offensive.
Right. Now, Dr. Gilbert, now in your initial response, you did hit the nail right on the head, and this is something I also wanted to discuss with our guest on this panel today. Now, sir, it's a war. Of course, each side will have their narrative. But a lot of the narrative which is out there is a very Western narrative, talking about all that Ukraine has done. If you can tell us a little more about what is happening from the Russian side, and to give the world a perspective of how Russia is progressing in this war, because a lot of the audience which is watching this as well will not have an idea about all that is going on the Russian side in terms of state media or state televisions or the kind of reports that are going in. Is there anything more that you can add to the Russian perspective in the ongoing conflict?
I will say that Russian electronic media, television and the internet, are the main sources of information for what the Russian perspective and Russian achievements are in the war. The print media is almost useless. But the Russian state television has a great deal of information on the mood of the Russian leadership and of the people, which Western media are not reporting. In this case, going back 2 to 3 weeks, Russian military experts who were given the microphone on air were very cautious about the prognosis for the development of the Russian military effort in countering the Ukrainian counteroffensive. They were saying, well, in war, many things can happen. We can't be confident. We don't know the depth of Ukrainian reserves, and we cannot even consider what a Russian attack or offensive will be until and unless we know what is left of Ukrainian reserves. In the past 10 days or so, that has changed dramatically. And the Russians obviously are quite confident that Ukraine is exhausting its reserves, and that, for that reason, in the near future, Russia can stage its own offensive without fear that it will face an onslaught from unknown and uncounted Ukrainian reserves. The point that the Russians are making is that whatever we hear from the United States, about $500 million in additional equipment and financing for the Ukrainian war effort, or about the $200 million that were rumored a day ago, this is irrelevant. The 50 Leopard tanks that Belgium is giving to Germany to give to Ukraine is also irrelevant if the Ukrainians no longer have the officer and the expert tank drivers and the other capabilities necessary to sustain the war. Then the war is over. And that is the view that the Russians are arriving at now.
Dr. Gilbert, now to round it off, what's next for Ukraine and what can save Ukraine going forward? Is there anything, is truce the only way forward for them, or is there anything that they can do to turn this around?
Well, there are a number of things that can happen in the near future. One, we can expect, as I say, as you mentioned, the blame game. The blame game is going to accelerate. The Ukraine forces are going to be blamed themselves for being incompetent and incapable of using the Western equipment and strategy and training that was given to them. So we expect that Mr. Zelensky is going to be pilloried in the Western press. He will probably be removed in one way or another. And in the fall, we may expect a big push by the United States and its allies for a ceasefire. The Russians will resist this, and we'll see how that plays out.
Thank you for all your insights, sir. Of course, a lot of this, most of the audience would not get to hear anywhere else because it mostly comes from the Russian perspective. Thank you so much for joining in and sharing all your inputs. That was Dr. Gilbert Doctorow, an international affairs analyst, author and historian. Always a pleasure to speak with you.
Most kind for your invitation.
Right.